In 1790, Moses Seixas of Newport, Rhode Island, and Manuel Josephson of Philadelphia corresponded with each other on a halachic question, with Josephson composing what is effectively a halachic Teshuvah. Josephson raised concerns about the conduct of the Touro Synagogue in Newport, arguing that elements of the service were not being properly observed, and set out his reasoning in a letter. Their exchange provides an important window into the religious commitments and halachic awareness of early American Jews. It also stands as one of the earliest examples of a rabbinic-style Teshuvah in the formative years of Jewish life in the United States. Two individuals who have a common denominator. First of all, multiple common denominators. First of all, both of them were Jewish. Second of all, both of them lived in the United States of America in the year 1790. Third of all, both of them had an interesting honor of penning letters to the first president of the United States, President George Washington. After Washington was elected president, I think in 1789, so it was a normal thing that now all the different communities would issue letters of congratulation. And in the Jewish community, there was a discussion about who's going to author this letter. There was multiple communities, around 6 or 7 different communities in different cities in the United States, and who's going to write this letter. And so this was a conversation and a debate and a dialogue that went on for many, many months. And then ultimately what happened was, instead of one letter coming jointly from the Jewish community, there were 3 separate letters that came from the Jewish community. And yeah, if you're feeling, of course, then yeah, that many people feel that way. So one of the letters was written by the Jewish community in Savannah, Georgia. Another was written, and this is the most famous one, by the Jewish community in Newport, Rhode Island. And a third letter was written by Philadelphia, but representing 4 communities together: Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, and Richmond. So these are the 3 letters offering congratulations to President George Washington, and each writing in their own way what their hopes and aspirations are for the future. So I said that the 2 individuals that we're going to be talking about today have the common denominator that both of them wrote 2 of these letters were penned by the 2 individuals we're going to be looking at today. Number 1, Mr. Moses Seixas. Mr. Moses Seixas was a Jew of Sephardic heritage, and he is going to be the recipient of the letter that we're going to be reading today. He lived in Newport, Rhode Island, and he was the leader of the community in 1790. And as a result, when Washington comes to Rhode Island, Washington made a state visit to Rhode Island in the summer of 1790. And the reason for that was because Rhode Island was the last state to ratify the Constitution. You did not need all states to ratify, you needed a majority. But Washington wanted that all of the states wanted ratification should be unanimous. Rhode Island held out until the 1790, and so in the summer of 1790, when Congress went for break, Washington went up to Rhode Island, and that's where he met the different communities there, including Moses Seixas, who read out this letter to him. And what's notable about this letter that Seixas read out to him is that obviously Washington responds, and he responds to all 3 communities. All 3 letters he responds. In his response to Seixas, he lifts many of the lines that Seixas put in there, and he gave it back to him. And so now these lines are Washington's lines. And it's a very famous letter, because Washington talks about the fact that it is now no longer that, I don't have the exact lashon in front of me, but it is no longer that toleration is what we speak about. Meaning toleration is this model that there's the host, let's say the French or the Germans or the Russians, and they'll tolerate the Jews. And maybe they'll be very benevolent and tolerate them to a great degree and giving them a lot of things. And many Jews would have loved to have toleration. Like, the problem was intoleration. But what Washington does in this letter is he writes, we're not talking about toleration, as if one class of citizens is giving rights to another. No, your rights are inherent, just like our rights, just like we have rights here, you have rights here. So that's one of the lines that Washington has over there. There's also a famous line over there that the American government gives to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance, if I recall. So those words are from Seixas' letter to George Washington. So anyway, we're not here to talk about Washington's letter, but I want to give you the background of who this Mr. Moses Seixas is. And the fact is that in the summer of 1790, he has this meeting with Washington, presents him this letter. Well, we're a few months before that right now, and he's going to be the receiving end of the letter that we're going to be discussing here this evening. The composer of this letter, the one who wrote it, his name is Manuel Josephson. Manuel Josephson is a little bit of a different background. Rather than the background of a Jewish Sephardic Portuguese heritage, converso and all that, Josephson is an Ashkenazi Jew. He comes from Germany, and he's living in Philadelphia. He's the one who wrote the letter from Philadelphia that represented those four communities that we spoke about before. Till 1776, he lives in New York City. But when the British come and occupy New York, it's not a good place to be. So he moves to Philadelphia, and it's at that point that he remains over there. He is the one who's writing the letter that we're going to be reading today to Mr. Moses Seixas. The letter is written from Philadelphia on the 4th of February, 1790. Dear sir, that's the opening of this letter. This letter was printed for the first time in 1920 in a Jewish academic journal, however, not in full. In fact, as far as I can tell, it's never been printed in full. Some of the halacha parts that come up in here, when they were printing it in 1920, the people involved in that didn't find it all too interesting or relevant, and so they were looking for more like the historical nuggets that are here, and so they omitted it. As far as I can tell, I didn't find anyone who actually reproduced this letter in full, but Baruch Hashem, there's images of the manuscript that Professor Sarnai asked him, and he sent it to me. And so I typed the whole thing out, and we're going to go through it, and we're going to learn a lot here. We're going to get a real-life picture of what is going on in the United States of America in 1790, mostly in Newport, Rhode Island. Now, Newport, again, the Touro Synagogue is there, and there was once a time that this was a flourishing place. In 1790, it's not flourishing at all. They also suffered a British occupation, and it really gave that city a blow from which they never recovered. And the Jewish community in 1790 was a shadow of what it was pre-revolution, and that's going to be something that we're going to see throughout this letter. All right, so let's read what Manuel Josephson has to say. He says like this: on the 22nd of December last, I was favored with your obliging letter of the 3rd of the same month. Okay, so I received your letter, meaning Moses Seixas' letter, to which for the want of conveyance have not replied before. The want of conveyance means I haven't been able to respond. How am I going to get my letter from me to you? This is interesting because 1790, the war is over. How difficult is it to get a letter from Philadelphia to Newport? Apparently it's difficult. And he's saying that I didn't really have a way of getting you this letter, and that's why I never replied. It's true your brother-in-law, Mr. Chaim Levy, passed through, but his stay was so short, came to Philadelphia, but his stay was so short as to afford me time to take pen in hand. This much for an apology. So in other words, he came to Philadelphia, he was here for such a short time, I didn't have the ability to write this letter, and so that's the apology. Now, the writing is in 18th century English, and I pretty much left it that way. I just made minor changes to the punctuation here and there, but you're going to see words that we no longer really use anymore. But I feel that it's more inviting, so to speak, into their world by keeping it that way. All right. By your said favor, you are pleased to inform that you had perused that part of my letter to our sister, Mrs. Judah, relative to some... Okay. So you are telling me that you read my letter to Mrs. Judah. So there was a lady named Mrs. Abigail Judah. By the way, in this letter, we're going to read all the who's who in the Portuguese, Spanish-Portuguese Jewish community in 1790. All the big last names we're going to have. Seixas is one of them. That's number one. Chaim Levy. Levy is another. We mentioned that before. Judah is another. So Moses had a sister named Abigail. Abigail married Judah. And apparently, Manuel Josephson, first writes a letter to Abigail. And in this letter to Abigail, what happens is he's condemning what the shul, what the Touro Synagogue is doing in Newport. And Moses reads it. He peruses it. Peruse today usually means reading it casually. Then it meant actually reading it liyuna. So you read the letter about what? Some of the congregational matters and ceremonies in the practice whereof I did point out some improprieties and recommended an alteration. So Josephson is saying you got to change what you're doing in the shul over there. In answer thereto, you give a circumstantial detail of the situation of your congregation with the capricious and whimsical disposition of some of the individuals that compose it. So Moses now is like defending what's going on by him. He's like, I saw you wrote to my sister, here, let me give you a din v'cheshbon of what's going on. And he says the situation of your congregation, in other words, we know, I alluded to this before, 1790, not a good situation, not a lot of Jews living in Newport because of the war. He also alludes to the fact that there are some people who, I guess we would say, don't care all that much. Capricious and whimsical disposition are people who just do what they want, essentially, and so therefore they're not intending to follow halacha, I guess, and he's using that as part of the reason why he does what he does. Again, we don't know yet what's going on. As this letter will move on and continue, we'll understand what exactly the issue was there. At the same time, you insinuate that to recede from and alter your present mode would be very impractical, or at best, attended with much difficulty. You're saying that it'll be very hard to change, having been adopted not from choice, but from necessity. Nevertheless, if you were convinced that what I advance on the subject was the result of mature deliberation, you would one and all subscribe to my opinion. So Seixas writes to Josephson that we can't really change what we're doing. But if what you wrote is coming from mature deliberation, so then we'll change. So in other words, what you wrote is you wrote. You didn't back it up with sources. You didn't make the argument. So it didn't sound like it was mature deliberation. So therefore, we're not prone to listen to it. If, however, we knew it was coming from mature deliberation, then maybe we would listen. Okay. So now we get into the meat of the letter, in where Josephson now starts talking. These sentiments do me great honor and are highly flattering, especially in the polite manner you have conveyed them to me. I shall therefore endeavor, and I flatter myself, to say that it's amply in my power to convince you that what I wrote is literally just and conformable to our oral law as deduced and digested from Scripture, and by no means matter of my opinion of my own. You're making it sound like this is my opinion. It's not my opinion. Everything that I wrote is halacha. I wrote the halacha. So my job is now to convince you, and I flatter myself that I'm going to be able to convince you that what everything that I wrote is clear halacha, oral law, as deduced and digested from Scripture. It's interesting that he's like being madgish to Moses Seixas here, that by the way, this comes from the Torah. It's rooted in the Torah. It's rooted in Scripture. One of the interesting things about the Spanish-Portuguese community, this was true in Amsterdam, it was true in London, it was true in Hamburg, all the places where they set up, where these Jews who had fled mostly from Portugal, and they set up these diaspora communities, and many of them were raised as Christians and grew up as Christians, and then ultimately the New World as well. They had a very strong desire that the religion should be based in Tanakh. And in fact, the idea that there was sometimes a disconnect between what halacha said and Tanakh bothered them a lot. You could understand perhaps the fact that they were raised in a Christian society may have lent itself to that, more familiar with the Bible. And we're able to see in their educational system in Amsterdam as well, you're able to see they were madgish much more the teachings of Tanakh or whatever. So I wouldn't be surprised if Josephson, knowing this, writing to Seixas, is saying, by the way, it's rooted in Scripture. Like, usually when two Jews are conversing about a halachic matter, they don't need to go out of their way to stress that, but it could be that's why he's stressing that over here. Okay, for had that been the case, he goes on to say, like, if I would be saying my own opinion, then I should have written with a degree of diffidence. Diffidence, like I should have been more shy about what I'm writing. And I should have pointed out that we need to have mature deliberation and serious consideration, and I should have done that before I wrote. But the reason I didn't have to do that is because it's pashut. All these matters in question are to be found in our law books. I did not hesitate to write as they presented themselves to my mind. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. Permit me here to make a short digression by way of preliminary to the point in hand. So here is making a little bit of hakdama. The letter in a few places actually the same. It's 4 sheets of paper, and in each, in the middle of the page, like kind of where it folds, the letters are worn out. So that's why there's a number of places where it's a little illegible. over here. But anyway, what he gets into over here is that generally we know exactly what to do in terms of halacha. Everything's spelled out. If by chance there should arise a doubt concerning some matter or thing which is not clearly or explicitly mentioned, as it would be next to impossible to provide against every minutia that might come to pass. So sometimes that happens. There's no way that Shulchan Aruch or halacha would be able to cover every single scenario that's ever going to happen in human history. So when those doubts arise because of that, it is generally decided or solved by implication and comparison. So we basically take a parallel case that's similar and we say, oh, if the halacha is like that, so let's use our minds and let's analyze and let's compare and then we could paskin. Okay, so he's telling us how psak works over here, and is the business that in general comes before the chacham. Now this word I spelled with in Hebrew and in nikud because that's exactly how he wrote it in the letter. So it comes before the chacham of a congregation and by him determined. So normally when there's a suffix to something new comes up, you go to the Rav, you go to the chacham. But the case in question is not of that class, for it is distinctly to be found in all our law books of the first reputation. So it's an open and shut case. Therefore, this actually doesn't even need a Rav. This doesn't even need implication and comparison and all that we spoke about, which is, again, why I didn't give you Makairis and you don't really need mature deliberation or anything like that. So that's in terms of his askama. I want to point out one thing about the writing of the Hebrew. He's going to use Hebrew multiple times in this letter. And interestingly, this is he puts it in nikud over here, but the rest he drops the nikudis after the first instance. But what's interesting is, and maybe I should have brought a copy in, he writes it in Rashi script. He writes what we call Rashi script. Now, why did he write it in Rashi script? So the reason is, I think, because Rashi script is actually the Sephardic cursive, which means that Jews from the Spanish-Portuguese community, when they would learn how to write in cursive, they would learn it in the Rashi script. The reason Rashi print, the reason what we call Rashi script became that way is because printers use that, and those printers that actually used that script for the first time were coming from Spain. They were using a font that they were very familiar with, and so they use that. What was that? Who? Yeah, so 1 second. So here's the second point. If you look at it, it's my judgment, and I asked another person to look at it, like, this looks very primitive. And like the Zion, the Rashi Zion is completely messed up, and like he didn't actually do a good job. So the way I see it is, yeah, because he was Ashkenazi. He was actually not used to this, but he's writing to Moses Seixas. So he's like, okay, I'm going to try to write it in a way that will work for him or for them or whatever it is. And so he tries his hand at writing, and try it yourself. I'm not familiar with writing Rashi script, and try, you'll see. It's actually not so easy to do, and I think that that's what happened over there. But anyway, if you're interested, I can send you an image. You can take a look. You'll see. It jumps out at you that some of the letters, this is not the way the Sephardic cursive is supposed to look. And I think he was trying to write to his audience in a way that would resonate with them. And so that's sweet. That's sweet that he did that. Okay. Having thus much premised, shall now proceed to quote some authorities for the satisfaction of your good self and the rest of our brethren of your congregation, whom God preserve and multiply. So now I'm going into Makairis, basically. Okay. So we still do not know what he was doing so wrong that Josephson is upset about. We don't know that. But again, as we read, it's going to become clear. Says Josephson, it is allowed by one of the Chachamim that in a place where there is no Sefer Torah to read the Parsha at synagogue from a Chumash, commonly called Parsha book. So there is this idea that if you don't have a Sefer Torah, you could read the Parsha, you could do the weekly Kriyas HaTorah from a Chumash. But this is strongly controverted, or controversial. And among the many other reasons assigned against it is the following. So why are those? There's a number of reasons why we don't like this idea, but here's one of them. That by prohibiting to read from a Chumash, the spirits of the congregation will be depressed because an uneasiness on account thereof, which will animate them to probably purchase or get or acquire a Sefer Torah as soon as possible, that they may perform their duty according to the command. And he says, I'm quoting here from where? The Touro Synagogue. He writes this in Hebrew. Touro Synagogue, Beis Yosef, chapter 143, or as we call it today, Simin Kuf Mem Gimel. So what does he say over here? There's 3 points he says over here. Number 1, there are those who are matir to read a Chumash when you don't have a Sefer Torah. Number 2, there are those who disagree. Number 3, among the reasons that people disagree is because we want to make you suffer, so to speak. You can't do it. Why? Because now when it finished Shacharis, and as you're ready to sing Vayhi ben Sayyar, and especially if you're going to do with the famous Nigin, with the Rakshos, and you're like, you can't sing it. Can't sing it. Why? Because you don't have a Sefer Torah, and we're not going to let you read from the Chumash. If we're going to let you read from the Chumash, you're going to be emotionally satisfied. No, we want it to hurt. Like this, you're going to go home, and you're going to raise funds. Next week is going to be a Sim Sefer Torah. We're not going to say Tachron. Everything is going to be wonderful. So that's the strategy. And he says, where is this coming from? He says it's coming from the Touro, Erechaim, and the Beis Yosef, Simin, Kof, Mem, Gimel. So it sounds like that Manuel Josephson has a Tour, knows how to read a Torah, and is summarizing the Torah over here. So, okay, I think generally it's an interesting question. Like, what was the level of Torah knowledge among the Jews who were here in 1790? Now remember, Bichlal, when you talk about immigration coming to a new place, I can't say always, but generally speaking, the rule is that when you come to a new place, the first Jews that move to a new place are not the scholars. That's generally the way it works. Scholars are second wave, third wave, fourth wave, fifth wave, or whatever it is, and that's been a pattern throughout Jewish history, number one. Alachas kama v'kama, when you consider the fact that the bulk of the early arrivals that were Jewish to the New World were coming from the converso community, where many of them they were raised in families where they themselves were conversos, their parents were conversos, and so therefore their education was limited in that way. And so it's what was the level of knowledge of Torah at that time? Well, at least here we have, and it's interesting because he comes from Ashkenaz, he comes from Germany. But we're able to see he's quoting a Torah, and as you can see, he quotes it pretty accurately. And we'll look inside right now and see exactly what he's doing. And he's able to understand. Firstly, he has a sefer, number one, and number two, I doubt he's using it from memory. So he has a sefer, and it's not the only sefer he has, and he's understanding it, and he's able to turn that into relevant psak information. Okay, so what's he talking about here? What's the Torah? What's he quoting over here? What's the din? So let's go there. But before we go there, just one thing. You already understand what's going on. In Newport, they were not reading from the Sefer Torah. In Newport, they were reading from the Chumash. Why? We'll get to it soon. They obviously had Sefer Torah. This was a congregation that existed from earlier in the 18th century. So they definitely had Sefer Torah, but we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it more as we move along. But at least we're beginning to understand what the problem was. Okay. Says the Gemara in Gittin, Daf Samach Amar Aleph. The Gemara says as follows. We do not read from a chumash in the shul because this is uncomely for the community. It's not respect. It's not a way to exhibit respect for the congregation. Now, what does a chumash mean in Talmudic times? A chumash means exactly like Sefer Torah. It means exactly like Sefer Torah. Never then, instead of being all 5 books, it's 1 book. But everything else, the way it's written and the dinim, everything else is the same. How do I know? Because you have a Yerushalmi that there's multiple ways of knowing this, but one of the simplest ways is the Yerushalmi that says you're not allowed to take Sefer Torah and turn it into a chumash. Okay, you are allowed to take a chumash and turn it into a Sefer Torah. So you see that we're basically dealing with the scroll. It's a question: can you divide it? Can you not divide it? So you're not allowed to read the chumash. It's covered at tzibur. You need to have all of the 5 books of Moses. Okay, says the Beis Yosef on this in Archaim Kuf Mem Gimel exactly where Josephson told us to look. Says the Beis Yosef as follows. Because of Migdalois, he brings from the Migdalois. Migdalois is one of the commentators of the Rambam. His name was Reb Shemta ben Avram. He lived in the late 1200s, early 1300s in Spain. And he writes in Perek Tes of Hilchos Sefer Torah, meaning of the Rambam Hilchos Sefer Torah, that Rabbeinu Mishulam, there are a number of Rabbeinu Mishulams. I didn't spend time figuring out which one this is. So Rabbeinu Mishulam says, the Heicha De'in Lam Sefer Torah, when a community does not have a Torah, Mutter Likris B'chumash, you're allowed to read the Chumash. Don't worry. The Gemara said you can't read a chumash because of kavat tzibur. What's the kavat tzibur is irrelevant now? Why? You say it's not respect. What do you mean? I have no choice. If you're leaving the Sefer Torah in the Aron Kodesh, you're saying, Rabbi, say today you guys are not deserving of the Sefer Torah. We're reading from a chumash. That's not respectful. But if you have no other choice, you have no other choice. So don't worry about it. This is what Rabbeinu Mishulam said. This checks one of our boxes. Because remember, Josephson told us that there are poskim that say you're allowed to read from Chumash. Now we know who they are. So Rabbeinu Mishulam quoted by the Migdalois. Now the second thing we learned is that some people forbid it. Who are the people who forbid it? Rabbeinu Tam Omer Da'asur. Migdalois continues over here, says that Rabbeinu Tam forbids it. The only issue is covered at Tzibur. That's only if you add the Chumash the way it was in Talmudic times. A Chumash in Talmudic times was Mamish Sefer Torah. Never then it was literally Chumash. Chumash means 1 of 5. So it was one. If you're only one, but everything else is made exactly the same. It was rolled up, Glila and Gilya, and had the margins at top and everything like that. Of a Chumashim Shalom, you can take out a codex, you can take out a book. It's a whole other system. That Asa Likr Spam has nothing to do with Kavod Tzibur. That is a non-starter. Just like you can't. It's almost like a different book. So that you can't that you can't bring in. And so he says. That's why we can't bring a chumash, because what's a chumash in the times of Rabbeinu Tam 11? A chumash is a codex. They're no longer doing in the Middle Ages. They're not writing chumashim on scrolls anymore. So therefore, this permission that it's only covered at Tzibur and therefore we can circumvent it if we have no other option, that's off the table. So that's the view that forbids using a chumash. This same type of machlekes surfaces in other Rishonim. The Beis Yosef brings the Mordechai, writes in Perak HaNizakim, that's in Seixas Gittin, Sheyesh Medaktikin, there are some people who are careful, the Dafke B'Sefer Echad, Ein Likros M'nei Kavod HaTzibur. Ha B'Chumashim Didan, Sheyesh Kol Hei Chumashim Da'ata Ein Gnai Mutar. When does the Gemara say that you're not allowed to read from a Chumash? If it's Taka Chumash, if it's 1 of 5. But if you have a beautiful Tanakh, a printed book, a beautiful Tanakh, and it has all 5s, then it's fine. The Gemara's only concern was that it's partial, but now it's not partial. Now you have the whole thing, so it's okay. And based on this, it's mutter to read from a Chumash B'Tzibur. So it's a heter, but from another angle. The first angle was, if you have no other option, Kavod HaTzibur you could push away. That's what we saw before from Rabbeinu Meshulam. Now it's another heter that's more like lechatchila. The whole Isser was why? Because there's only 1 of 5. Now you have a book that has all 5. It's not a problem whatsoever, even though it's not written as a Sefer Torah. This is one shita in the Rishonim cited by the Mordechai. However, here too it's batted down. Ravya is Rabbi Elazar ben Yoel HaLevi, one of the great Rishonim from Ashkenaz. The Ein B'divrei Mamish. That's don't take that seriously. The Lo Yavatama. The reason why you're not allowed to read from the Chumash is because of the Yerushalmi. It's Yerushalmi Megillah Paragimel that says Migoydin Nafshin Aguma Anan Zavin Lan Torah. Because they're going to be depressed, they're going to force them to buy a Torah. Pirush, if we're going to be sad that because it's forbidden to read from a chumash, and therefore it is forbidden. So here you have very clearly, it's basically 2 columns in the Rishonim. One column in the Rishonim that allow the Kriyas Torah from a chumash, another column that forbids Kriyas Torah in the chumash for the reason that, for multiple reasons, but including the reason that we want actually people to feel compelled to read from the Sefer Torah. So Josephson quoted all of this, and he's basically trying to say, you're not reading from the Sefer Torah, and you're instead doing an alternative, you're reading from a Chumash, but is there room to be matir it? So his answer is, yeah, there are sources that allow it, but his basic point is that he's basically saying we don't paskin that way. We don't paskin that way, and therefore you should not be allowed to do what you're doing. He continues now and brings another source to back up his idea. In a place, he's quoting another din, in a place where there are but few Yehudim. Very interesting. A few Yehudim, here he decides he's going to use the Hebrew word with the Hebrew spelling, who occasionally read their prayers with minyan. And probably no one among them may know to read from the Sefer Torah grammatically and with the Taimim, notes, in parentheses, he writes notes. They must nevertheless read from the Sefer in best manner they can, Ibid. So in other words, this also is from the Torah, or the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef tells you that if you have no one who knows how to lane from the Sefer Torah, too bad. You take the Sefer Torah out and you figure it out. Don't walk away from Kriyas HaTorah. So in other words, now we're getting a little more information. Why in Newport were they not reading from the Torah, reading from Chumash? Because they didn't have anyone. They didn't have a Baal Koyre who was actually able to do it. So he's bringing a source that says, even if it's a place where there isn't a Baal Koyre, you bring it out and you do in the best manner that they can. I found it very interesting that he wrote the word taimim in Hebrew, and then he realized that he has to open a parenthesis and write to Seixas what that is. In other words, he wasn't convinced. He knew Seixas knew what Yehudim is. He didn't have to say that. He knew Seixas knew what Sefer Torah is. He didn't have to say that. He knew a minyan, and he knew Chacham. So these are basic words in Jewish lingo. Taimim, he wasn't sure. And so he had to write in no, so there, Touro Chaim, he's not concerned about that, because there, precisely because Seixas said it wasn't mature deliberation, he's like, okay, you want my mature deliberation? Here, I'm giving you Makoros. So I know you don't know what this means, but you're looking for Makoros, so I need to tell you what the sources are. But here, this is part of his narrative. And so the fact that he writes notes tells me that he wasn't so sure if Seixas even knew what Taimim were, which tells us something about Seixas. And as we're going to move along, I think this picture is going to be rounded out a little more. Okay, so he's saying that he brought another quote that says, you don't have someone who knows it alone, you bring it out, you figure it out. Where is this from? So he says it's from chapter 142, indeed. It's from the Beis Yosef, Erech Chaim Siman Kuf Mem Beis. Where does it come from? The Beis Yosef over there. Remember, Beis Yosef is always quoting. It's an encyclopedia, essentially. I mean, sometimes he's speaking in his own voice, but so much of the Beis Yosef is just bringing Makoros. And so here, he's bringing Moireinu Arav Rabbi Yisrael. This is Rabbi Yisrael Isserlin, the author of the Trumas Hadeshen, 1300s, 1400s in Germany, where he writes like this: B'yishuv sheyesh minyan, if it's a little darf, a little community, they have a minyan. Ve'emi sheyadei likris patera ka'alacha b'diktuk v'taim, and they don't have someone who knows how to read properly with the trup and with all the diktuk. Nonetheless, you bring out the Torah, you read it the regular way, and you do a bracha. So he's quoting this accurately, and his point is, you're saying you don't have a guide to read it? Doesn't matter. The halacha tells us what you're supposed to do in this situation. Why are you reading from a chumash, which is so controversial? Here's what halacha is telling us what you're supposed to do. He then brings another quote. His third quote in this section is like this: in a congregation where the reader is not perfect in the taimim, in which case it is customary that some other person should read from a chumash and the chazan repeat after him from the sefer. So this is what we call in modern language an unterzager. Care should be had that the prompter do not raise his voice too much so as not to appear like two voices, and he says ibid. So he's telling us that in the Torah, Simin Erech Chaim Siman Kuf Mem Beis, there's also this idea that if you're doing unterzaging, make sure that you're not too loud, so that we only hear the Bal Koira, we don't hear the unterzager. What does that prove? What that proves is that in your situation, when you don't have Bal Koira, so you get an unterzager. No one said over there, take out a chumash. Well, we said it. In other words, Jewish law accommodates for the idea that you don't have a Bal Koira. And we deal with it, and we work around it, and we have a system for it, and that's the system, and you're taking a different route. And so therefore, that's contrary to halacha, and it is not okay. Small note, I didn't find this last quote in the Torah in Erech Chaim Kuf Mem Beis, and I couldn't spend all day looking for it, but I didn't see it. Not in the Beis Yosef, not in the Torah. So I don't know where it comes from. The closest quote I found comes from the Lavush, Siman Kuf Mem Beis. Now, I don't know if he's quoting from the Lavush. Maybe he's quoting from somewhere else. Maybe someone one day will point this out and show me what I missed. Ich weiß nicht. But let's read what the Lavush says. You have a yishuv that has a minyan, and no one there knows to read Likris Batoira. Sorry, I typed it wrong. Likris Batoira ka'alacha b'diktuk v'taimim. Nonetheless, read from the Torah. And the custom is that you put by the chazan someone who reads to him the taimim metoich chumash. But the makre, who's the unterzager, should not do it b'kol ram. Why? So we only hear the chazan, and we don't want to mix up the tzibur because you can hear two voices. Today, kole lo mishtame. So it's pretty close to what he was saying over here. But again, I didn't see the actual quote. All right, so oit chazan lamoy to figure out what happened over there. He concludes this section by saying the preceding rules are corroborated by the renowned Rambam, Maimonides, he says. Yada Chazaka, Hilchos Sefer Torah. Okay, this I have no clue what this is. Rambam and Hilchos Sefer Torah, to the best of my knowledge, does not talk about Kriyas Torah. He talks about how you write a Sefer Torah. And so these issues about what do you do if you don't have someone who knows how to read, and do you take it out and do you not take it out, is not in Hilchos Sefer Torah. And notice he didn't give a chapter number. Now, there are two chapters in Hilchos Tefillah where the Rambam does talk about Kriyas Torah. It's Parak Yud Beis and Parak Yud Gimel. However, I didn't find anything of this there, except for that you're not allowed to read from a chumash. Literally 4 words. You're not allowed to read from a chumash. But all the other information that we're dealing with over here, is there an exception to the rule? And what if you don't have a Sefer Torah? And why can't you read from a chumash? And what if you don't have someone who knows how to lane? And the unterzag, I didn't see any of that in the Rambam. So again, unless I'm missing something, ich weiß nicht. So I don't know exactly what happened over there. Okay, now let's continue in this letter. Now, you can notice here that I divided this in sections. I just want to highlight that's my division. In the letter, this is one long flowing narrative. He now says as follows: it cannot be expected that any authority can be produced which in plain terms prohibits the taking out of a sefer and laying it by, and instead thereof read from a chumash. What's happening here? He's saying, okay, let me tell you the way what happened here. What happened here is as follows. In Newport, they weren't just reading from chumash. Now we're getting more information. You know what they were doing? They got their Vayi ben Soya Aaron with all the bells and whistles, and they took the Sefer Torah out. And as is going to become clear later, the minhag in Sfard is you do Hagba first. They also did the Hagba before Kriyas Torah. Then they put the Sefer down on the side and they read from the Chumash. Now he condemned this as, hey, you're not allowed to do it. That was a letter that he wrote to Abigail Judah. Hey, this is not okay. You can't do this. And now he's explaining to Moses Seixas why not. Now remember, Moses Seixas wrote to him a letter saying, hey, why do you have a problem with what we're doing and everything like that. In that letter, Seixas said, bring me a mucker that says you're not allowed to take the Sefer Torah out and put it on the bima and read from a chumash. That's what he said. Bring me a mucker. Tell me where it says it. It's like, you know, which verse in Tanakh tells me that you're not allowed to do it. So he's like, that's a fake expectation. Like, it cannot be expected that I'm going to be able to produce an authority that in plain terms, meaning he probably asked for it in plain terms, prohibits the taking out of a sefer and laying it by instead thereof read from a chumash. I say it can't be expected that a din should be produced. Why? Because it cannot be supposed that such a thing would ever happen. Who in the right mind would, like, why would that even ever get codified? Like, why would you do it? For as above shown, it is scarcely allowed to read from a chumash where there is no Sefer Torah. Much less can it be supposed it would be done where there are many. So I showed you that when there is no Sefer Torah, you're not allowed to take out a chumash. So now this is where we get into comparison. Kal v'chomer, if you have a Sefer Torah, how much more so you can't take it out, schlep it out, put it on the side, and do from a chumash. So like, the answer to your question is I can't give you chapter and verse, the point, but let's think about this in a more sophisticated way. He continues and says, to transcribe the various authorities respecting this subject, which are all of the same import, would swell this to the size of a pamphlet rather than contents of a letter. So if you want me to bring all the Makaitis that prove that it's not okay to do what you're doing, then it would stop being a letter and it will turn into a kuntras. By the way, he got pretty close to producing a kuntras. I therefore flatter myself that the foregoing quotations will suffice to convince that the mode you follow is not only wrong in theory, but common reason explodes the practice. Okay, now I had to go to Claude and ask, the word explode, how is this word used in the 18th century? Because we don't talk about common reason exploding a practice. So I didn't check it up any further, but what it told me was that explode was used then very commonly to say reject. You don't blow up a practice? I don't know. I never heard anyone talk that way. They said it means reject. They rejected it. What? I hear you. Okay, so his point is, what he's saying is, it's wrong in theory, but also common in reason. Now he's invoking common sense to say that what you're doing is wrong. Now, common sense has a place in halacha, so now he's going to actually bring a mucker that common sense plays a role in psaktit. Let's see what he says. It is doubtless with this view that one of the most ancient and much revered authors lays down the following general rule in these words. He says, one of the most revered and ancient authors. Now, I doubt Moses Seixas knew who this revered and ancient author was, because he's going to quote now from the Orchos Chaim. Now, this quote from the Orchos Chaim, I was suspicious maybe it's in the Beis Yosef, which he clearly has access to, but it's not. And Beis Yosef is a very, very well-known sefer in the 1700s. Orchos Chaim already is not such a well-known sefer in the 1700s. It's really interesting that he quotes it here. He's going to quote it later as well. Now we're getting a little bit of a picture of Josephson's library. We know that he had, I'm not sure about his Rambam, by the way. I don't know if he had a Rambam. In fact, maybe he did not. But we know he had a tour with a Beis Yosef, and we know he had an Orchos Chaim. So what's the Orchos Chaim? So let's actually, instead of reading his, he gives the Hebrew, and he translates it into English for the benefit of Moses Seixas. Let's just jump to the actual quote. The Orchos Chaim over here is talking about the halacha that we read Parshas Acharei Mos Yom Kippur morning. And the question is why? What is the reason? So Pashas, the reason we're reading Acharei Mos is because of the avodah of the Kohen Gadol, what he did on Yom Kippur. So it's very appropriate. But there are additional reasons that were already said in the times of the Rishonim of why we're doing this. So one of the reasons he says over there is that we learn different lessons of how careful we need to be from sin. Now here, it gets a little interesting because, one second, what was the sin? What did they do? And so there's multiple opinions of what, let me clarify, we're talking about, it opens with, Achrei Moshe b'nei Aaron. Literally, that's the opening word. So the message is there. The message is not only in the Avodah of the Yom Kippur, which is later, but in the opening, Achrei Moshe b'nei Aaron, they died for a reason. Why they died? They perished because of a sin. Now, what was the sin? So according to one of the views, the sin was they went into the Mishkan, Shsuya Yayin, they were already inebriated, they were intoxicated, this was not okay. So he wants to make a point that you learn from here that you have to use, even if something isn't a command, but if your logic tells you that you shouldn't be doing it, even if there's no command, God's coming after you. And that's an important thing to know on Yom Kippur, because you need to do tshuva on those things. And it may not have been an Isser Mamish, but if logic dictates that you're not allowed to do it, so then you need to do tshuva of it. So how do I remind a Jew about that? I bring this Achrei Moshe b'nei Aaron. Why? Because where was there a command? There was no command. In fact, where is the command? It's after. Right? And we say, what? And that's how we know. How do we know that it was Mikdash? Because right after that story, right in Parashat Shmini, that's when Aaron is told, Yain v'shecher al tesh. Oh, so if you're told now, why are you punishing them for going in Shtu Yain? Elamah, you don't need a command. Also have a command. Now it's a command, so it's holy, and now it's an additional way we're able to connect to Hashem, and it's a special thing. But you didn't need that to know not to do it, he says. If you say that the sin was drinking, well, there was no command. So we derive from here, even where we do not have a clear prohibition, if logic tells us that we shouldn't be doing the activity, and there's going to be a big, big punishment if one isn't careful of this, just like with Nadav and Avihu. By the way, this is an interesting topic, a standalone topic, about what role does Seichel play in terms of determining what's right and what's wrong. But there are other examples of this. So, for example, there's a famous passage of the Chizkuni, where the Chizkuni asks, how come the Dor HaMabul was punished? They were not commanded. At least he doesn't see a clear and an open command in the stories of the Torah that they were commanded on the things that they violated. And so he wants to know,
Say the same thing about Cain.
Yeah, you could say the same thing about Cain, yeah. I don't know if the Chizkuni does, I don't remember. But the Chizkuni definitely brings up the issue of the Dor HaMabul, and what he does is he says, you know why they were punished? Because people know. People know that you're not allowed to do it. And we're held responsible for that. And so these are kind of sources that lend themselves to the idea that, because there's another narrative. The other narrative is that you can never use logic at all to determine right and wrong. Don't even start. It's all divine command. And once you start with logic, you end up in a checkmate. Here we see it's actually a little more nuanced. There are some sources that lend themselves to the other narrative, en kama koime, to get into unifying it into one whole. But so why is he bringing this here? He's bringing this here because he wants to end this piece by saying that it's not only wrong because of the sources I brought, it's wrong because this just makes no sense. And so that's why you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. All right. Now, he continues here, and in the next piece, he's going to give a solution of what they should be doing. You say that Mr. Rivera, more on him in a minute, reads Hebrew perfectly. Surely then, it can't be so mighty a task for him to read from the Sefer a few chapters occasionally. All right, a few comments on this. Number one, Rivera reads Hebrew perfectly. Okay, what about the other people? So is it that Rivera is the only person who reads it? That's why he's the only one who's like being discussed as the potential Baal Korah? Or maybe the other ones do read Hebrew, but not so good, not so well. Okay, but that's interesting. So now we're learning that the Jews of Newport don't have a fluent Hebrew reader at this time. Is that what this is? Or maybe Mr. Rivera is like the designated chazan, and like he does everything chazan related, and he's not going to let anyone else, and so maybe that's why it's focusing on him. But maybe theoretically, I don't know. I tend to think more the first way. The first way, but I'm not entirely sure. Okay, that's number one. Number two, the other R over here, he says, so it's a big deal. He could read from a Sefer a few chapters occasionally. So unless the English language has changed, occasionally doesn't sound like to me this means every Shabbos. So are we seeing here that they're actually not convening every Shabbos? Which will not be a surprise, because as, again, we're moving along, this is a community that was hurt by the war, a lot of Jews left, there aren't a lot of people there, and maybe they're actually not convening all. Maybe they're only convening once in a while, and that may be hinted at the word over here. I'm sure there are other sources that would shed light on these questions. Okay. Common report says him a man of understanding and docility. Okay, use that word. Pull that out later today. Say docility. Okay, open to learn. So he's a person who's understanding. He's open to learn. He was bred to strict rules of Judaism. All right, so this guy's a very frum Jew. And doubt not, which means no doubt, has imbibed the sentiments of his much respected and worthy father of honored memory to keep up and support our holy religion and worship in every respect as much as possible. He had a father. This Mr. Rivera, there was a famous man who lived in Newport. His name was Jacob Rodriguez Rivera. Jacob Rodriguez Rivera was from the founders of the Newport Touro Synagogue. And he died in 1789, a year before this correspondence. And he was a passionate Jew. And his son is Mr. Rivera, by the same name, Jacob. And he's the potential Balkaira over here. And the point is, he grew up in such a home with such a passionate father who literally just passed away a year ago, that there's no doubt that he would be able to do this type of job. So let's just put him up as a Balkaira. I therefore have no doubt that on his being made acquainted with the preceding passages, like if you teach him what I told you, which show that the reading of the parsha from the Sefer is so essential and strictly commanded by our laws that he will not hesitate to perform that part of the service, especially when it can be done so easily by means of a prompter. Get him a Unterzager. Or, if that should not be agreeable, if you don't want to do that, to read the words, although without the ta'imim, would still be preferable to your present mode. So, you have a very simple thing that you could and should be doing, and this is what he wants him to do. Now, what happens over here is, let's move into the next section. I shall now endeavor to solve your question. So he's now going to quote from Seixas' letter, where Seixas wrote to him the following. Why is it more wrong to take out a Sefer without reading from it at Shabbos and holidays than on Kippur night and Hoshana Rabbah? Okay, so what happened? What happened over here is that in Josephson's letter to Abigail, Judah, he wrote, you're taking a Sefer Torah. So firstly, it's wrong for all the reasons we said. Secondly, there's another issue that we didn't even discuss yet. That is, you're bringing a Torah out and you're not using it. And that's a problem. You can't do it. If you bring a Torah out, you need to read from it. So Seixas writes to him, what are you talking about? Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre, we take Torah out, we don't read from it. And Hoshana Rabbah, we take the Sefer Torah out when we're doing Hashainis and we don't read from it. So clearly it's okay to take a Torah out and not read from it. So now he's asking this. This is a question that he's asking. This becomes a long mini essay that Josephson writes back to him, all about Minhagim and the difference between Minhagim and Dinim. And it's actually not even entirely clear how this is answering the question. On the one hand, a lot of the material is really interesting because he talks about what is the reality in America, what's going on in terms of the level of knowledge and people, and there are some very interesting quotes in here. But at the same time, it's very long-winded, and it's hard to even understand where he's trying to go with a lot of this information. The answer that I think he's giving comes all the way. If you go further up to, where is it? If you go on to page 10 in the handout. Okay, actually page 9 of the handout, the last paragraph. It is not much approved to take out a sefer unless for the purpose of reading therefrom. So he generally says, you're not allowed to do that. I stand by that. You're not allowed to take out a sefer unless you're reading. Though no positive prohibition against taking them out at the several times before mentioned, it's not an isser. Therefore, the ancient great congregations have established such customs as aforesaid amongst themselves and keep up to them. So therefore, that's how the minig developed, that we take it out of Hoshana Rabbah, that we take it out Kol Nidre, because it's not an absolute isser. Nevertheless, the famous law writer called Baal HaTurim, from which he quoted, from whose extensive works we derive almost the whole of our laws. So we see he's a big fan of the Torah. By him collected from Titus Moshe and properly digested. Like digested not in the sense of eating, but like a digest. Right? So a book of, so he organized all of the Torah as also a great part of our customs and our minhagim, as under the head of customs and ceremonies of Sukkot the following words. So he brings the following when it comes to Sukkot. And he says, he quotes here from Tur Orach Chaim Siman Tov Reish Samach, where he's talking about the Hoshainus. And he brings the Rasag, the Torah does, although Josephson omits that it's the Rasag, He doesn't, just like he did that before, where he omitted the fact that it was coming from another rabbi. He doesn't want to complicate things. But what does our Rasag say, and the Torah brings us? That you know when you should do your Hashainis? After the Haftarah. In other words, not the way we do it after Shachris. Do Kriyas Torah, do the Haftarah, the Sefer Torah is out. Great, now do why? So that we shouldn't take the Sefer Torah out for no reason. That's what Rasag says, and the Torah brings it. Then the Torah says, but that's not the minik. So what do you see from here? What you see from here is it right to say you don't take a Torah out for no reason? It's definitely right. It's broad in halacha. Is it an absolute isser? No, it's not an absolute isser, which is why you're allowed to if there's a compelling reason. And I guess we would say there's a compelling reason, kol nidra. There's a compelling reason by hoshainis. So in that case, because it's not an isser mamish, so you're allowed to do it. But it's a thing, you can't make light of it. And the reality is that you don't have a compelling reason. You don't have a compelling reason, and therefore you shouldn't be doing it. That seems to be his answer to that particular question. Before I quit this subject, must notice the great stress you seem to lay on exhibiting the Sefer expanded, as if of great moment. Moses Seixas, when he wrote, yeah, we want to do this. We want to take the Torah, even though, why? Hagba. They wanted that moment where you lift the Torah and you show it to all the people. And so he says, you will be pleased to observe that such exhibition, although universally practiced, is but a secondary ceremony to the reading from it, and signifies that the congregation are to take notice that this is the law from which we are about to read or have read, the appointed lesson or portion for the day. It's only a minig. It's a minig that here is the Torah that we already read from, one minig, or that we will read from, the Sephardic minig, as he's going to get into in a second. Now he has to clarify, because he's worried that Seixas is good. What is it? We do it before, we do it after? We only do it before. What's he talking about after? I say or have read because this exhibition is performed in many congregations after the reading is finished. And in a different mode, in different congregations, different minhag, which is not my present purpose to describe. I don't want to get into it. Only that it is never done unless at such times when the Sefer is to be read or has been read, as aforesaid. So Hagba only happens if you're reading the Torah. You're not so firstly, Hagba is not so important. So don't have Mesiras Nefesh for Hagba, number one. And what's more important is the Kriya, which is a din. And this touches a little, although he's not so clear, in the 5 pages that we skipped, which is a lot of interesting material. One of the things he's doing there is he's teaching Seixas about the difference between a din and a minig. And like here, there's confusion. You're basically saying, I'm not going to do Kriyas Torah, but I'm going to schlep the Torah out because of the minig of the Hagbas. He's like, number one, it's only a minig, so you don't really need to have Mesiras Nefesh for it. And number two, the whole minig is connected to the Kriya. This is a Torah you read, or this is a Torah you're going to read, but if you're not reading it, then you don't have Hagba. Or to use a yeshivish language, the chalois of Hagba doesn't take effect. You don't have a Hagba here. Okay, so he says, so we do this every day, except on the fast of Tisha B'Av in the morning service, when that ceremony is omitted. We don't do Hagba Tisha B'Av Shachris. We don't do Hagba Tisha B'Av Shachris. So the emes is, this is an interesting Maisa. So we see this a little in the Seixas of Teshuvah Knesses Hagdolah Siman Lamed Zayin. This is Reb Chaim ben Avisti. He passed away in 1673. And this Teshuvah is dated to Menachem of Tov Lamed Beis, which is 1672, Izmir. He writes, Minig ha'olam b'tes ba'av shaloi lases hakama sefer Torah b'shachris k'mo shanoigim b'shar yom. We don't do hakama sefer Torah on shachris of Tisha B'Av, he says. And he says this is minig ha'olam, which means that in Izmir, in the Ottoman Empire, Jews are not doing Hagba. Where does this minig come from? There's no source. Maybe because it shows joy. Because I see it's so common, but it's so wrong. So I say it's a mistake. And then he goes to bring all the sources how important Hagba is. You must do it. Portugal, the Portuguese Jews. He was the rabbi, I guess, of the Portuguese community in Izmir. And he signs Chaim ben Yisrael ben Avisti, Izmir Menachem, which is Menachem of Tov Lamed Beis, 1672. So apparently, it was probably common in the Portuguese communities, the diaspora, not to do, and that's what Josephson is saying. Although it is also the case that Josephson is Ashkenazi, and he makes it sound like it's universal that no one does Hagbah on Tisha B'Av. I didn't do extensive research. I didn't see yet a mucker from the Ashkenazim that some people are not doing it. And I don't know what the bottom line is, what the different communities are doing today. So anyway, that's an interesting derech agav that comes up. Last paragraph of this section. Sfarim are now and then taken out on some extraordinary occasions of great solemnity that occur in large congregations, which to explain would be too tedious, but never expanded on those occasions. So I don't have time basically to explain how sometimes we take out a Sefer Torah, like by, I don't know exactly what the minhagim then were, but like by Achnasa Sefer Torah, you take out a Sefer Torah. Or if the ruler would come, there was a minhag to take out the Sefer Torah, and there were other things like that. He's like, I don't want to get into that, but the bottom line is this is not something we take lightly, only when there's a real minhag to back it up. There's no real minhag to back it up over here, and so therefore this should not be happening. Now it's a shame that we didn't have the ability to read those paragraphs before. I do want to tell you that one of the big things he talks about here is how American Jews don't have minhagim kvuim. In Europe, there's minhagim kvuim. You walk into a shul, everyone knows exactly how it's done. You can't change nothing. He describes how in America, the people are like, well, minhag, whatever it is, and one chassan comes, he establishes one set of minhagim, he moves on, then the next guy comes and says, what? That guy doesn't know what he's talking about, you have to do it differently. And then all of a sudden the minhagim change, and he talks about the fluidity of minhagim in American shuls, both Ashkenazi and Sephardic, and he talks about it as coming from a degree of lack of knowledge, I don't know if it's coming from apathy also, that I'm not sure, but he describes it at great length, so some people are interested in those paragraphs from a historical perspective because of the comparison between Europe and America, so you can have a chance to look at that later. You may enjoy some of the lines over there. Okay, now all of this was centered around one halachic issue. The one halachic issue was the minhag in Newport, if you can call it a minhag, to take out the Sefer Torah and read from the Chumash on Shabbos when they would have a minhag. But there was another question that came up that Josephson is now going to give an answer to. I duly observe what you are pleased, which means you chose to say, respecting the blowing of shofar. Here's another issue. A maisa about the shofar. Your reasons for not performing that Solomon strictly enjoined service, so this is something a Yid has to do shofar, are beyond doubt a great way. So you didn't do, or you don't want to do it, or you're not going to do it, that's not clear. It looks like last year they didn't blow the shofar. That's what it looks like. Meaning, Rosh Hashanah, 1789 in Newport, the shofar was not sounded. So he says, there's no din to be found that insists on blowing a shofar where there is none. Yeah, you didn't do anything wrong. Because there's no din that says, I don't understand what this means. Like, of course there's no din that says you don't have to blow a shofar if you don't have one, because how could you? Right? What would the din say? You have to blow a shofar when you don't have it? But he's like, you didn't have a shofar, so okay. So Emalasot didn't have it, and there's no din that says that you have to blow a shofar when there is none. Okay. But there are strong injunctions to procure one if possible. You got to get one. And that is a duty incumbent on every son of Israel to hear the sound of it at the appointed time, say, meaning like which is, or namely, Rosh Hashanah. The blowing at all other times is no more than a minhag custom. So like the other times that we blow, for example, at the end of Yom Kippur, that's a minhag, so he's letting him know. By your letter, it appears you have instructed Mr. David Lopez. So Lopez is another one of these big hotshot names of Sephardic Jews in America during the colonial period and in the revolutionary period. Aaron Lopez was a very, very famous one, and Mr. David Lopez is related to him in some way. So Aaron Lopez traveled to Hamburg. Hamburg is one of these cities that has a Sephardic Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. You have one in Prague, you have one in Hamburg, you have one in London, you have one in Amsterdam. And so he's going there, probably for business reasons, and you asked him to bring a shofar. That fully complies with the aforesaid injunction. Great, you did the halacha. You sent a shliach to get you a shofar. In the interim, if it should not arrive in time against the next season, remember he's writing in the winter, so if it's not going to be here by the coming Rosh Hashanah of 1790, I doubt not you might procure the loan of one from New York. So you can borrow one. There's the congregation here in New York. They presumably have an extra shofar, so you could borrow from them. It's really interesting because basically the idea that you can buy one in America is just a non-starter. The idea that anyone here knows how to make a shofar, I mean, there are animals here, right? But the idea that anyone here knows how to make a shofar is not even discussed. And not only that, in Manhattan, They have 2 or 3. Fine. So they'll lend you one, but they're not going to sell you because they need to have all their shofars. So you really have you don't have a serious Judaica market over here. And they're sending a guy to Hamburg. Now, of course, he went there for business, but they hope to get a shofar from Hamburg. Gives you a little picture of if only Judaica world was around in those days. Okay. Nay.
Shofar factory, 13-year-olds.
You're saying they should have the shofar factory in a Hanami. Where was, what do they call it? Living Legacy or something like that. Okay. Nay, which means moreover, the cracked one you have might be made to answer in case of need. Oh, so now we're understanding what happened. Why don't they have a shofar? The shofar got cracked. Now, how did the shofar get cracked? How did that happen? So I don't know. Should I make up a story? No, I'll leave it alone. Okay. Say for the want of a good one. So, in other words, if you don't have a good one, you could use the one that has a crack. How? There are many rules laid down how to manage in case of a shofar is cracked or otherwise defective to make it fit for use. But those rules are so precise and difficult that I shall omit to mention them except one, which appears the easiest to be performed, and it is as follows. And here he quotes a din. If the crack is lengthways and not too large, so that by winding a strong packing thread round it, the crack does close, and its sound be the same as it was before it was cracked, it is lawful to use it, but not otherwise. And stopping the crack with beads or sealing wax or anything else is deemed unlawful. So here he seems to be quoting dinim from Shulchan Aruch, Simin Tov Kuf Pei Vav, or Chaim Tov Kuf Pei Vav, that talks about the cracks in shofar and how to close them up. And I wasn't ma'ayin too much into this, but he seems to be giving them the eitzah of how to fix it. Essentially, he decided he doesn't want to get into it much, but he does give them a recipe for how they could move on. But we're not done yet, because there was also an issue with the person blowing the shofar. The problem is, here key lines are illegible. And because these key lines are illegible, it's hard to understand what exactly was going on over here. But he's talking about the blower, and he says that we are ashamed from the goyim. And he writes it in Hebrew, Gimel Vav Yud Mem. So there's somehow this blower, we're ashamed for the goyim by having him the Baal Tukaya. But with this difference in your favor, that you are not ashamed, okay, I don't know what the next few lines mean. If no other could be found, then such profligate, which means some morally corrupt person, as you describe him, I should not hesitate to suspend that part of the service for once, until a person of good character would undertake to practice and perform, rather than have a stigma cast on us and be derided not alone by goyim, but also by pious and well-thinking Yehudim. This is interesting. Till now, he's quoting open dinim in Shulchan Aruch, in the Torah. And in fact, you don't need to be a Rav to say anything that he said till now. Yeah, there's dinim about, for example, if you go to the halachas of a Talmud is not allowed paskin in the vicinity of his Rav, or if his Rav is alive without a shus. But then the place can say, but Bamed Varim, if it's a real psak. But if you're just quoting a din from Shulchan Aruch, someone asks you, what bracha do you make on a cookie, you're allowed to tell. And by extension, all other things in that category. Everything that he said so far is pretty much, what bracha do you make on a cookie? So he wasn't really paskening. But now, he slid over very casually into the realm of psak. Now, again, I don't know the details over here, but there was a case of someone who is of ill repute, and he says, okay, we're going to cancel shofar. You're not going to hear shofar because it's going to be a chilul Hashem. And he says, in such suspension, I think myself quite justifiable by a scriptural text. Psalm 119. The true translation of meaning whereof is, there's a time to work for or serve the Lord by making void his laws. There's Eis Asa Hashem, sometimes for Hashem. You work for him. And you do what he wants. How? By a Feru Tarasecha. Now, this is not the pshat of the pasuk. The simple pshat is Eis Asa Hashem. This is an emergency. Why is it an emergency? Because because so many people are going against the law, so now it's Eis Asa Hashem. Chazal darshan it this way. Chazal, and Rashi on the pasuk says, an example, Eliyahu Bahara Carmel, where he brought Shchutei Chutz, he brought a carbon out to the Beis Hamikdash, Eis Asa Hashem. How? Hefeiru Tarasecha, that we're going to break the Torah, and why? Because of the emergency moment. So he brings that here, and he says, of this we have several instances recorded in Scripture. I just mentioned one, too lengthy at this time to enumerate. So again, he realizes that he doesn't want to go on too long over here. But this is a real psak din to say you're not going to hear shofar on Rosh Hashanah because of the Chilul Hashem. Okay, I'm not
convinced him to do it. A minute ago, he was telling him you should blow shofar, and I was like, actually, don't.
Well, there was two issues here. One issue over here is whether you have a shofar or not. Now the other issue is you have a Baal Takei or not. So, but again, the shofar is like it's good you sent for Hamburg, and yeah, you can fix the shofar, but yeah, you're going to have to get a good Baal Takei. And it looks like it was last year. Meaning, it looks like in 1789, if I had to guess, Rosh Hashanah 1789, they did not sound the shofar in Newport for two reasons. Number one, they only had a cracked shofar. Number two, now by that wouldn't have stopped them. Because they would have, number two, they weren't happy with the Baal Takei. So as a result, that's what they did. So he says, but again, the cracked shofar, firstly get a new one and fix it. But again, the Baal Takei, I actually think you did what's right. So that's interesting. This is a real, so there's a broader conversation over here, and I guess we'll have it right now just for 40 seconds, and that is, what's the first American Teshuvah? What's the first Teshuvah written by a posek in America? So I'm not going to say this is mamish the first, because you have to go look at other rabbinic writings, and then what if someone wrote in one letter, a din, said Shabbos, by the way, this week starts at 7:42, so are we going to count that as a Teshuvah? So you have to actually sit down and go through all the halachic writing that exists among Jews at the time and make a determination. But this definitely could be of the first. You have someone clearly scholarly in Josephson, number one. And number two, he's not just quoting a din over here. He actually gave this Newport a psak about this issue in terms of the blowing of the shofar. So maybe this is the first. It's definitely of the first. Teshuvahs written on American soil by an American scholar to a fellow American Jew. Okay, let's continue. I can't avoid to say a word in justification of Mr. Uriah Hendricks. We're almost finished. Mr. Uriah Hendricks is a well-known figure. He, in fact, was the president of Seixas Yisrael here in New York. And he was in Newport. And he didn't come to shul. And Moses Seixas is very upset that he didn't come to shul. So he says over here, basically, Josephson justifies it. And he says, yeah, because you run a non-halachic, you're not running it properly. So I actually also wouldn't have come. And it looks like that there was an attack there where he said he didn't want to come because he didn't want to give a donation. It looks like Seixas wrote that. Because if you look at what Josephson writes over here, I will not venture to say in defending his conduct that there might not have been a small tinnet of parsimony mixed with it. So I'm not going to be shaylo that there was parsimony, which means kamtsonos. So I think Moses Seixas wrote to him. He didn't want to come because he didn't get an aliyah by his chumash, and then you're going to have to give a donation, and he didn't want to. And it's going to cost him a lot of money. So he says, I'm not going to gate that, but at the end of the day, he was right to not show up, because I also wouldn't have showed up, because I wouldn't have shown up because of the thing. Yeah. He then moves on to say another few things. I'm just going to summarize this briefly. It comes back at the end of the letter and is like, by the way, if you leave the Sefer Torah inside and you read from a chumash, you only solve half the problem, that you didn't take the Sefer Torah out. But that's not the way to go. So don't fix it that way. You need to fix it in the way I told you before. And then he says another point. You need aliyas. People need aliyas. And he says a very interesting line. Look at the last line in the paragraph before the box where it says, moreover, it is recommended that every Yehudi ought endeavor to be called to the Sefer at least once a month if possible. Okay, I'll be honest with you. I never heard of this. That there's an Inyan to get an Aliyah every month. And he says, you're taking that tzchus away from the people. So is it a thing? The answer is yes, it is a thing. Elio de Vidas lived in the 1500s. He's famous for writing the Reishis Chachma, but he has another sefer called Teshuvah Chaim, and over there he writes that a person should get an aliyah once a month. You're connecting your soul to the Eitz Chaim, and that's the way you connect to Hashem, and that's a pasuk Atam Adveikim Hashem Alekeichem Chaim. You get it through your monthly aliyah. Now, he's living in Eretz Yisrael in the 1500s, but this is quoted in the Sefer Yosef Oimetz, which was in Germany. I don't remember the dates right now, Yosef Oimetz, but it's the 1600s, if I recall correctly, the Menhagim of Frankfurt. We've quoted it a few times. Josephson's coming from Germany, so he would have been aware. It means this was in the ear in Germany. And is another sefer, the Chavis Yor has it also, aliyah once a month. So this was definitely in the air in the 1600s in Germany, and Josephson knew it, and so he's making a mention of it to him. I think I'm gonna speak to the Gaboim about bringing this back, because I think it's gonna be good for income. So that's okay. He then gets into the donations. It looks like there was a question over there of, is it like, can you do away with the donations in shul? And Josephson tells him, yeah, it's a minig. If you don't want it, you can do away with it. And that's there. And now let's read the end of the letter. Okay. I doubt not you will agree with me that it is full time to close for the present the subject of congregational affairs. In simple English, let me translate this. I think you want this letter to end already. And if that I have here in advance should prove satisfactory, it will afford me no small pleasure. So if I did a good job and you like it, I'll be happy. I have, however, to apologize for my drawing out this letter to such unreasonable length, which is occasioned partly, as you will please to observe, by rendering into English most of the authority cited. So you're going to be happy I translate into English. So kind of it's because of you're an Amoritz, so that's why the letter is long. Okay, and partly by such illustrations as I conceived requisite to throw some light on those customs and ceremonies as are not generally known. So I also have to, again, because some things are not generally known, I have to give you that information. And above all, my desire to return measure for measure. What does that mean? Is he saying that Seixas' letter to him was very long? It sounds like that, right? You gave me a long letter, so I'm having to come essentially and doing mida keneged mida, and I'm giving you a long letter. And must request that you will be pleased to excuse any inaccuracies or, I had to Google this, tautology, which means when you write a double language, that may have escaped me, which your friendship and politeness leaves me no room to doubt of being readily complied with. Okay. A paragraph about a man named Henriquez, which we are going to skip. As no more room is left on the paper, it literally is at the bottom of page 4 here, must of necessity conclude with adding that Mrs. Josephson, meaning his wife, and our niece return their best thanks for your friendly salutations, and offer theirs to your good self, Mr. Seixas, your good mother, and rest of the family. And believe me, with sentiments of great regard, dear sir, your esteemed friend and humble servant, Manuel Josephson. Ladies and gentlemen, we perhaps read the first Teshuvah composed in America. Maybe not the first, but it's definitely of the first. And it's very interesting. It sheds light on what is going on in Newport at the time, what people know, what they don't know, what's the level of knowledge, what's the level of observance. I do think you see a desire of, we want to get this right, like we want to do the right thing. There isn't this like, oh, we want to throw this away. No, we want to do what's right. There was a reference to capricious people, who that's kind of more like we just do whatever we want. But Moses Seixas comes across as very sincere. He wants to do it right, but some Jews don't know. Some Jews do not have a lot of knowledge. I'm reminded of in Tafshan Lamed Gimel, the Shazar, who was the president at the time, came to the Rebbe. And he was talking about the Soviet Jews who came out of the Soviet Union and came to Israel. And he's going, und bei Zeis Faran, as a greise schreckliche Amaratzes. You can hear the audio. He's speaking in his Yiddish. A greise und a schreckliche Amaratzes. And he was trying to say something positive. And nonetheless, I love these people because they're loyal and they're dedicated. So the Rebbe says, Anoshim Pshutim. And then the Rebbe says that I heard from the Fidik Rebbe that we should say Anoshim Pshutim instead of Amaratzim. Amaratzim is a little pejorative. Anoshim Pshutim is less pejorative. Moreover, in Kabbalah, Pshitus is a Maila. Pshitus is like you're higher, you're God, the way he's before categorization and before Svidus and everything like that. And that conveys the idea that Anoshim Pshutim are connected on a very high level to the Eibusher, the way he transcends all the systems that he put in place or whatever. Okay, conversation continues. Amaratzim, Anoshim Pshutim. I think the Rebbe corrected him 3 times, if I recall correctly, whatever. So I'm reminded of that when I see this. I think the American Jewry that comes across over here in this correspondence is Anoshim Pshutim. People are trying to get it right. And it's a little window into that. So I wanted to share that with you, and I want to conclude, because in the beginning we spoke about the letters of that the Jewish community sent to George Washington and his response. So I quoted a few things from Washington's response, but I want to give you the ending of his letter. We're going to conclude with the ending of his letter. This is the ending of Washington's letter to the community in Newport, 1790, just a few months after this whole thing. So the ending goes like this. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. So at the end over there, Washington is using a pasuk from Micha that's actually talking about Mashiach Tzaitan, that will dwell ish tachas gafnoi v'tachas te'enasai. and ve'ein machrid. There'll be no one to make them afraid. So that's a beautiful blessing from Washington, and let us hope that we continue seeing that here in this land. Ad bias goyel tzedek.